This episode is brought to you in partnership with the Colorado Chapter of the Nature Conservancy. Guided by science and grounded by decades of collaborative partnerships, the Nature Conservancy has a long-standing legacy of achieving lasting results to create a world where nature and people thrive. On the fourth Tuesday of every month throughout 2023, Mountain and Prairie will be delving into conversations with a wide range of the Nature Conservancy's leaders, partners, collaborators, and stakeholders, highlighting the myriad of conservation challenges, opportunities, and solutions here in the American West. I'm very excited about this year-long series, and I greatly appreciate the Nature Conservancy's generous support. To learn more about the Nature Conservancy's impactful work in Colorado and around the world, visit www.nature.org/Colorado. This is the Mountain and Prairie Podcast. I'm Ed Robertson. My guest today is Taylor Hawes. Taylor is the director of the Colorado River Program for the Nature Conservancy. As the leader of the program, she guides TNC's efforts to conserve the freshwater biodiversity of the Colorado River Basin while also meeting human demands for water. Challenging objectives given the wide-ranging stresses facing the river today. But despite the challenges brought about by climate change, overallocation, and increasing demand, Taylor and her team are making great strides towards finding long-term solutions to create a sustainable future for the Colorado River. Taylor grew up on the East Coast, and from a young age, she felt a deep connection to land, water, and natural resources. She fell in love with wide-open spaces while on a course with the National Outdoor Leadership School, and she's devoted her career to protecting land and water in the West. Before joining the team at TNC, she served as Associate Counsel to the Colorado River Water Conservation District, working on water quality, water policy, environmental permitting, and water rights litigation. If you pay attention to the news, then you'll know that the Colorado River has been receiving tons of media attention for the dire conditions and projections facing the entire region. Reservoirs are at historic lows, temperatures are rising, and the need for more water is increasing. In the first part of this conversation, I asked Taylor to decipher many of the surface-level sound bites that I've heard in the news, and she provides some much-needed context and background regarding the river basin's current challenges. We then talk about how TNC is working to solve these problems by building community support, working collaboratively with tribal nations, and helping agricultural producers become more efficient. And we spend the last part of the conversation talking about Taylor's professional journey, why she chose to do this work, what gives her hope, and her goals for her work on the Colorado River. This was a timely conversation, and I hope it sheds some light on the challenges facing the Colorado River, and I hope it provides some optimism about the river's future. Thanks so much to Taylor for taking the time to chat, and thank you for listening. Taylor, very happy to be chatting with you. Thanks for taking the time. You do a lot of important stuff, and so this may be the least important thing you do all month.
Or it may be the most important thing I do all month.
We'll see. I was thinking about how I wanted this conversation to go because there's so much to cover. You know, you start talking about water in the West and it gets complicated real quick. But I was thinking maybe the best way to start would be with this current crisis that we're in now with the news, and how the news is constantly covering it. It's all over the country. People in Maine or Louisiana or care about water in the West right now, which is probably a kind of a unique moment. And there was a really great article that was written in the magazine 5280, and there was a quote near the end from you, and it said, "The next 6 months to a year will be critical to whether we create a system that's sustainable and resilient for the future," talking about the Colorado River. So can you just kind of give a brief overview of what in the world is happening right now?
So I think it is important to understand that we are in a crisis right now, but it didn't happen overnight. Mm-hmm. This has been building for many years now, even decades. It started to really become apparent back in the early 2000s. 2002 was a record drought that really started to get people's attention. But there's three things happening. One is that we are using more water than we were 20, 40 years ago. Mm-hmm. So we've got more people, growing food and fiber, we've got industry here, so there's a lot of demands on the system. The other thing we're struggling with is climate change and aridification. It is getting hotter. It is drier. It's hotter here in western Colorado and in eastern Utah than anywhere else in the lower 48. So we're the advance guard, not in a good way, when it comes to climate change and increasing temperatures. And when you get increasing temperatures, you get thirstier atmosphere and drier soils. And so even when we get a normal snowpack, we lose a lot of it to these drier soils. So we're dealing with this kind of aridification idea that you might have heard about, and it's just this hotter, drier soils. But not only are we losing water to these hotter, drier soils and thirstier atmosphere, we're also increasing our demand because of this temperature increase. Farmers can grow more crops. Maybe they used to get 2 crops a season. Now they get 3. Or you're watering your lawn in Colorado in November when you used to stop in September.
Oh, I see. Yeah.
So we're just slowly increasing our demand because of this as well. And then the third element of the crisis is what I would refer to as our governance structure or our laws. They have not adapted and kept pace and changed quickly enough to adapt to these changes we're seeing in our climate. So the laws that we passed back in 1922, we might touch on this. The Colorado River Compact is the legal framework that divvies up the water between the 7 states. And then there's also a treaty with Mexico. Those laws were all passed in the 1920s and 1940s. And a lot has changed, and we could have never predicted how things would change in terms of our climate. Our forefathers could never have foreseen this. But we haven't made the changes in our laws to increase the flexibility to allow us to adapt to our new situation.
There was another article I was reading that you were quoted in, and you were talking about how we need to have put in place a long-term solution and no Band-Aid solutions. What kind of Band-Aid solutions have there been over the last 50 years? Because I'm just not as familiar with all the details. But what are some small things maybe that have been done that really have not been as effective as they should have been?
Yeah. So there have been small things and big things.
Yeah.
Back when they wrote the compact in the 20s, they all thought there'd be surplus water. They thought, this is conservative, even though the science was even back then telling them maybe it wasn't conservative. But they wanted to hope, and it was easier to negotiate an agreement thinking there was more water and that we're going to be able to divvy that up later. So in 2001, 2003, they were actually starting to negotiate what to do about surplus. Who gets the extra water? Because at that time, California was using most of the surplus water. The 2002 drought hit. And that 2002 drought really, as I said, was a wake-up call. And so they went from negotiating what to do about surplus. As soon as the ink was dry, they turned to negotiating what to do when there's shortage. And that's what they call the 2007 interim guidelines. And that is... it's essentially an amendment of the compact. So people always think that the compact can't be touched. But if all 7 states and the Bureau of Reclamation can agree, so the Bureau is the federal government representative, if they can all agree, they can change the rules and they can make operational changes. And that's what the interim guidelines were. They kind of put in a system in place to acknowledge that there should be some equity. So like when Lake Powell and Lake Mead, which are the 2 biggest reservoirs, and they bracket the Grand Canyon, when one is low, they might release more. So if Lake Mead is low, Lake Powell would release more, Lake Powell being the upstream one. And sometimes if Lake Powell was low, then maybe they don't release as much to Lake Mead. And it's a very complicated, complex agreement, that has all sorts of trigger points and thresholds. But that agreement was meant to help us navigate shortages, and that agreement expires in 2026 or into 2025.
Okay.
So that's a lot of the pressure right now is like, okay, these rules will expire. It's an opportunity to get it right. But in the meantime, they thought that agreement and those rules would last and be able to withstand whatever nature threw at us. But they were interim because we also recognized that things were changing and we needed to be able to have some flexibility and not have them become permanent. In the meantime, things started to get worse. And so in 2019, they adopted a new set of regulations and rules called the Drought Contingency Plan, or DCP. And that was another overlay on top of those interim guidelines. And that's what you hear a lot about in the lower basin right now. You're hearing occasionally that Arizona is taking shortage and Nevada and Mexico are taking shortage. That was part of the DCP agreement, was to say, what happens if Lake Mead reaches really low elevations? And they struck an agreement that California would take shortages last, and the other three, including Mexico, would take shortages sooner. And so that's where we are now. So we're scaffolding ourselves up, but frankly, we're about to enter a new SEIS, a supplemental environmental impact statement, is being considered right now to make additional changes to those interim guidelines to be able to release less water from Lake Powell than was considered back in 2007.
And this is just a very basic question. The whole problem with this podcast is everybody can see how little I know about everything. But these people that are doing the negotiating, who specifically are they? Who are they, and what authority do they have?
Yeah, great question. Each state has a representative that's been selected by the governor. And appointed by the governor. And it can change,
How political does it get?
The appointment within the state usually isn't that political, but it can be. It's usually somebody that has a role of authority. So in Colorado, it's the head of the Colorado Water Conservation Board, Becky Mitchell. In Arizona, it's their head of Department of Water Resources. In California, it's the chairperson of the Colorado River Commission of California. So it's a little different in every state how they do it, but it's it's typically a leader in the state, and then they might have an advisory team. They have technical experts they rely on. So it's a group negotiation, but it's actually one representative from each state that has the say at the end. Okay,
that makes sense. Before we talk more about the specific crisis right now, can you lay out for people who aren't familiar kind of the percentages of usage of water in the West? Because I think a lot of times people who aren't really that deep in the world, they'll see Las Vegas and they're like, they're taking all the water. But that's not necessarily the case. I mean, Las Vegas in a lot of ways is a crown jewel of the best way to go about it, which is surprising. Right. But can you talk about the percentages of water use?
Sure. So agriculture, growing food and fiber, uses about 70 to 80%, depending on where you are. And it looks different in different parts of the region. I mean, in the upper part of the basin, it's more ranching. In the lower part of the basin, which is California, Arizona, it's more lettuce and carrots. And I mean, of course, things like alfalfa too. But they get maybe 9 crops a year up in the lower basin, and up here they get maybe 2 or 3 crops. 3 would be a lot.
Okay.
So it looks a little different, but about 70 to 80%. And then cities use about 12 to 15%. And that sometimes includes industrial use. So it can be, if industry is getting their water from an organization like Denver Water, then that gets counted potentially in what they call M&I, municipal and industrial.
Okay.
And that's 12 to 15%. And then the rest is, evaporation, environmental, not even environmental, but just uses by trees. And
sure.
Yeah.
As it's gotten hotter, does that evaporation, has that become significantly a bigger portion of the use?
Absolutely. And I think that's one of the things we don't really understand right now is we don't have a formula that we can rely on yet. So for 100 years, forecasters were decently accurate, and they could kind of predict if we get 100% snowpack, we might get 97% runoff. Now we're seeing formulas that we've never seen before. So, for example, in 2021, we had a 90% snowpack and a 33% runoff.
Wait, explain that to me. I want to make sure I understand.
Yeah. So snowpack is governed by a 30-year average.
Yep.
And when we say we got 100% snowpack, that would be the average of the last 30 years.
Yep.
We're right there, 100%. That's we're right in line with the average.
Yep.
Normally, in the past, I should say, if you got 100% snowpack, you probably get pretty close to 100% runoff. Yep. All that water would make it to the river. And now we're seeing this huge difference. So we got a 90% snowpack, So decent, pretty good.
Yep.
But then a 33% runoff. That's what made it to the river. So the rest, the difference between the two was either evaporated or it got soaked up by really dry soils because it's been so hot.
Yep.
So they call it runoff efficiency. It's a kind of a new term, actually. I mean, one I hadn't heard before 3 years ago. Is just we're seeing our runoff efficiency decrease dramatically. And we don't really know how to forecast that yet. So it makes it hard for planning purposes to be accurate when we don't know how much water will translate from snowpack to in our rivers.
Yeah, because that's a huge gap.
Yeah.
That's not a little rounding.
Yeah, it was scary.
I remember, I guess it was 2012. That was a pretty big drought year, and I remember there was a ton of snowpack because I was paying attention to it because there was some run I was going to be doing in the San Juans, and they were talking about canceling it because there was so much snow. But it got really hot really quickly, and by the end of May, there was hardly any snow left, and there was a forest fire there in mid-June.
Yeah,
and because I remember it was by the end of the race, my throat was all messed up because of the smoke. And I remember thinking how weird that was because it had been a huge snowpack year, yet it could change that quickly. Man, there's so much there to...
And it can be wind, too. That can be a huge issue is we can have a great snowpack year like now. If April is hot and windy, it can just be lost to the atmosphere.
So in my understanding from reading a little bit of news and listening to some podcasts, there was the government came in a few months back and said, all right, we got to reduce consumption quick. And this problem that had been brewing for a really long time all of a sudden became an emergency.
Yeah.
First of all, why now? Why January of 2023 versus last year or versus next 2024?
Yeah.
What made it such a emergency right now?
Yeah, I would say the number one reason, there were a few, but the number one reason was the potential for Lake Mead to drop below the level in the reservoir in which they could release water for hydropower.
Okay.
So they were going to lose the ability to create hydropower, which in its own right is worrisome, right? It's a lot of hydropower for the region. But they didn't really know what would happen. They didn't know if they could release enough water.
Sure.
They didn't know. It started to threaten whether they could release water to the lower basin. They'd have to run it through what they call the outlet tubes rather than the turbines. And the last time they ran water through the outlet tubes was in 1983. You may have heard the book Emerald Mile.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, so
definitely.
in that book, in that story, which is real, they were running water through the outlet tubes and it started to erode the canyon walls.
I'd forgotten that,
Yeah, so they fixed it at the time, but they haven't tested it since. So they're started to worry, what would happen to the dam? What if we had to release all of the water through the river outlet tubes? That creates a lot of uncertainty.
Yep.
It also threatened if the reservoir levels dropped too low, it would be impossible for the city of Page and one of the chapters of the Navajo Nation to be able to get their drinking water. So it just started to have the impacts were on the horizon, and they were serious impacts, and they just put a spotlight on how uncertain our future would be if we kept letting the system drop. But it also showed us it's really getting out of control. We are not in control anymore. And I think that was one of the big wake-up calls is the Bureau of Reclamation has a modeling crew here in Boulder. And they started to realize that it was headed down really quickly. And you can imagine these big reservoirs, the lower you get, the faster they go.
Oh, yeah.
Because it's like a pyramid at the bottom. So that was another thing is just realizing, we're in uncharted territory here. And that was, I think, the real wake-up call. I would also add that when the Commissioner of Reclamation said we need to reduce 2 to 4 million acre feet, that's an incredible amount of water. California's whole allotment, which is the biggest user, is 4.4. Arizona's is about 2.8 million acre feet. And so it's a tremendous amount of water, and it was asking people to make cuts without a plan. And I think that's led to the tension and a bit of chaos in the basin because we don't have a plan.
So can you run through that timeline? When did they make that announcement or with that mandate? So they said you need to cut 2.4
2 to 4.
2 to 4.
Right, big range.
Big range. And you need to do that by when?
So the announcement came from Commissioner Tootin at a Senate hearing in June of 2022.
Okay.
And I think some people knew, but it was a surprise to a lot of people, including people who work on this issue every day.
What did you think when you heard it?
Well, I wasn't surprised, but it was a surprise to hear it announced during a hearing.
Sure.
The community that works on the Colorado River talks to each other, sees each other all the time. Now, COVID impacted that a lot. However, to hear this being announced at a Senate hearing was a surprise. Now, once you kind of took a step back from the surprise element, it was not surprising that we had gotten to that point that quickly. So she made the announcement in June, and she said the 7 states need to reduce their water use by 2 to 4 million acre feet by August. Mid-August was what she said. And the states didn't do that, and there was no consequence.
That's what I was going to ask, or what?
Yeah, well, exactly. You always have to have a consequence. Yeah. I think the Bureau is now and the Department of Interior are now catching up with that. They initiated an environmental impact statement to assess what would happen if they reduced less water from Lake Powell than was formerly allowed under the environmental impact statement from 2007.
Okay.
So that's why we're in this process right now of a supplemental EIS to analyze the impacts of reducing the releases from Lake Powell. Mm-hmm. And there will be impacts. And the one place you'll see it is the Grand Canyon, which is obviously, the crown jewel of the park system and one of our natural wonders.
So what would you predict would happen there that a normal person could recognize and see?
It could have impacts to the fisheries down there. There's native fish that we are trying to recover, and that's something TNC's been working on, not in the Grand Canyon, but up in the upper basin. That it could have negative implications for those fish because it could give smallmouth bass and other fish an advantage if it gets warmer and
they get a little
lower.
Slow. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
It will certainly impact recreation. If you're a boater and you have a Grand Canyon permit, you would notice a difference because they've been releasing about 8.23 million acre feet each year, which translates to a typical flow rate would be about 12,000 CFS.
Okay.
This could be quite a bit lower. It could be 8,000 or 9,000 CFS. So just if you're a boater, that would make a big difference. Mm-hmm. And they wouldn't have maybe the control they've had before over how they release the water and when they release it. If they're not able to make energy production, hydropower, that would look different in terms of releases from the dam. Yep. So it just, again, creates a lot of uncertainty. We don't know what that'll look like. But I would go back to the supplemental EIS. They announced the supplemental EIS in December. They asked for comments, and they're going to be hopefully releasing alternatives for that anywhere in the next month. It could be any day now.
And so in some of the things I read, and correct me if I'm wrong, this is why I talk to smart people because I'm never fully sure I've got it all right. But there is almost like a threat, or the consequence is if the states can't agree on something, then the federal government's going to come in and say how the cuts are going to be made. Is that correct?
Well, time will tell. We don't know yet. The feds do have the ability to do that, and that is why they're doing this supplemental EIS, so that they can evaluate, under the laws of the country, make sure that whatever alternative they come up with and decide to implement, it's been vetted properly.
Got it.
So that's where we are in the process right now, is they are making sure they do things by the book. Whereas when they made that announcement back in June, they didn't have a plan. Now their plan is, okay, we're going to go through the EIS process and make sure we're doing it correctly so that we can cover ourselves.
So what do you think? Like, you're in this world all day, and in my old work doing water rights work on the Arkansas River, I was kind of halfway connected with the Colorado River community because, living in Colorado Springs, I think we get 70% of our drinking water from the Colorado River.
Yep.
And so, like, when you hear about this chaos and this just uncertainty that not even the best experts can really have an idea of where it's all going, How does that affect your ability to do your job? I mean, how do you process all this info coming at you in a way to focus on solutions? Because I feel like that's what you and that's what TNC is doing, is you're figuring out positive ways to make all this work.
Right.
And so how do you deal with how do you process all this information?
Yeah. We kind of think about it in two ways. One is we have to stay abreast of what's happening with the bigger conversations.
Yes.
So we're staying in touch with our state leaders. Because the Nature Conservancy works in all 7 basin states and in Mexico, we kind of keep our fingers on the pulse of what's happening, make sure that we understand where things are headed, influence when we can in terms of don't forget the environment, make sure let's not completely, damage the environment in the process of making these decisions. We're up in that 30,000 foot space and trying to be part of those conversations, giving the river a voice in those negotiations. The other half of our work, though, is really about solutions on the ground. At the end of the day, rivers are local. They're running through a community. They are the water supply for a farmer. So we recognize, too, that we don't have a ton of control over what's happening at the 30,000-foot view. We're not going to be at the negotiating table. So while we can be kind of on the periphery of that and influencing it, where we have a lot more influence and ability to find solutions is working on the ground, working in communities. We work with farmers a lot. Farmers, as I mentioned in the beginning, and ranchers use about 70% of the water. So if we're going to have to live with less water in the future, working with agriculture to find ways to reduce their water footprint is critical. And we want our farmers to be able to continue to grow, produce food and fiber. We all eat food.
Yes.
So we're kind of dependent on them being able to continue to have their livestock or grow produce. Being able to invest in how farmers adapt to this is one of our main priorities. And that's been something we've been working on since I helped get the program started back in 2008. Farmers don't have that kind of extra income to try things. That's where the Nature Conservancy can help, is helping them try new things. Maybe it's paying them to reduce their water use in a particular year. Right now, we're also we're working with farmers to try alternative forage crops. A lot of our crops on the western slope are for livestock. Can we try other crop types like kernza rather than alfalfa, or rather than hay grass or pasture grass? So that's a big part of what we do, is try to work with willing farmers and ranchers who are willing to try something new and find ways to reduce their water use.
Yeah, I think that's, in my experience working with farmers, they work so hard, and they're in it. They need to make a living, but they also just have a love affair with working with the land. And, there are definitely plenty of careers that could be less risk and a lot more reward than farming. But thankfully, they're out there every day making our food for us. Yeah. But there's just such a low margin financially, and there's such a low margin for risk. And I would guess that convincing farmers to try some new way that has not been proven can be seen as well, that's crazy. I couldn't imagine taking on that kind of risk. So could you talk a bit about some of the new programs or new ways of going about business that TNC has presented to farmers, and maybe a couple of success stories that you can think of, things you're proud of? Well,
first of all, you have to remember that water in the West is a property right. It's different than in the East, where we have something called riparian doctrine that's based on English law, so it's based on court law, court cases. In the West, it's a system of property rights. And farmers, it is drilled into every farmer by their parents, who usually started the farm, or grandparents. It is drilled into them that if they don't use their water, they'll lose it.
Yes.
I mean, that is one of the tenets of Western water. Use it or lose it. Yep. And so we're having to overcome that. And it's a cultural lift. We're trying to assure farmers that if they don't use their water, they will not lose it. We spend a lot of time with water attorneys trying to give comfort. Maybe we tweak the law here and there if folks agree that that's needed, we will work with our farmers as a coalition to give them confidence that they're not going to lose their water rights. So first we have to overcome that fear.
And so the fear would be if there was some, like, for example, a program in place where they could be paid to fallow land for a season and not irrigate it and keep that water in the river.
Right.
They're scared that if they did that, they would lose the water right, which is equivalent to losing private property.
Right.
So like losing a farm.
Right.
And without the water, their farm is kind of worthless.
Right.
And so is that an example of a solution you guys are offering?
Yeah, so that's like a policy side of the argument, is making sure that that our water laws are flexible enough and provide enough protection for a farmer to participate in a conservation program and not have their water rights threatened.
Yep.
So that's just like one thing that we have to do that to give them confidence to be part of this solution and take that fear away.
Yep.
So that's one thing. That has led to, for example, in the Grand Valley area, we've worked with farmers to do a pilot project where we worked through the district to have farmers enroll in a program to reduce their water use. So now people call it system conservation or demand management, which is just essentially a program for a farmer to not use all their water. So it may be split season, it may be full fallow, in any given year, and then they get paid to not use their water. Mm-hmm. But by working with the district, we were able to, give the program a little more credibility. We put them in the driver's seat. We let them hire their own lawyers. We paid their lawyers.
Oh, nice.
But by using their lawyers, the attorney-client privileges between the attorney and the district, it just gave them a lot more confidence so that they could trust what they were hearing from their attorneys, but they didn't have to take that financial risk. So we did a pilot program a few years ago for 2 years, a conserve consumptive use program. We use lots of technical and wonky terms that really are not very good descriptors of what we're doing, but basically paying farmers to reduce their water use. We paid a little more so that the district could then reinvest it in infrastructure improvements.
Okay.
Because they were struggling with, their infrastructure might be 100 years old. And so farmers are also continually trying to modernize their systems.
Sure.
And this was a way for us to work with farmers in their district to reduce their water use. The water ended up back in the river, flowing downstream to Lake Powell, but on the way, it was also benefiting endangered fish and probably recreational flows too. But also, it let some of the money come back to the whole district.
Nice. So that
we're not out trying to, pay one farmer who is going to make all this money and while his neighbors are struggling, we really wanted it to be something that could prove that it could be good for everybody. And that was a few years ago. And now, we are doing projects in the Verde River, which is in Arizona. It's upstream of Phoenix, another great example. In that case, in the Verde, they grow a lot of alfalfa.
Yep.
And we started to look at the stream flows, and when we were seeing the lowest stream flows was in the hottest part of the summer, so June, July. We did a pilot project that has now become more permanent, to pay farmers to try a different crop. So they grew barley.
Okay.
Barley can grow with just winter precipitation. It's harvested early, so like May.
Okay.
It doesn't require all that draw from the river when it's at its hottest and lowest. So it keeps more water in the river. But then, to make it really work for the farmer, we also had to have a market for the barley.
Oh, yeah.
Right? You can't just be like, you're going to grow barley, and then what?
They'll just give you a lot of money for
right.
the barley. Yeah.
Great job. Yeah. So we worked with other partners in the area, in the community, to invest in a malt house.
Wow.
So we kind of had to. We went full circle.
Sure.
Not only did we develop the relationship with the farmers, help them trust us, make sure we did things like infrastructure improvements. We changed out their head gates. They used to have to change their head gate with a wagon wheel, and nobody wanted to cross the river in a storm to turn the wagon wheel and close the gate. So we changed it so we could use electronics to change it, and the farmers could do it with their cell phone. So they loved it. But, we had to start small. We don't just come in and be like, you guys got to do this.
Well, that's one of the things I've seen with TNC across the board, here in Colorado, like I always talk about Matt Moorhead, I think is a great example out east of just putting in time year after year after year, now probably coming up on 2 decades of building these relationships. And that's the same thing that y'all have been doing. And I feel like there's no shortcut to that I know of.
It takes time.
Was there a while when you were first getting started where maybe you weren't making any traction because these relationships take time?
Yeah.
I mean, was there ever a point where you're like, oh man, I don't know if this is going to work out, or have you always had just enough traction to keep it going? I mean, with the relationship building part of it.
Yeah, great question. I mean, one of my favorite sayings is progress happens at the speed of trust. So there is no shortcut. I never felt discouraged. I think you have to be an optimist when you work on water.
Definitely.
There's no way around that, because otherwise it can be discouraging. But the one thing that's interesting about working at the whole basin is you have to be a little bit opportunistic. You can't just come in and say, we're going to do this in this place at this time. You kind of have to let it build. And so you have to have your irons in a lot of fires, and then you never know which one's going to start moving. And I think we've seen that over and over again, is that we've had big wins and small wins along the way to just kind of like, okay, to just encourage us that we're on the right track and we are seeing change. And when I first started, one of my colleagues who was here before I got here, and I worked for government before I came to this role, and he said, well, it's not a real water deal if it doesn't take forever. And it's like, that's kind of how it used to feel, that it just every deal you just had to fight tooth and nail. Yeah. We're doing projects faster and faster, and they're bigger than they used to be.
And do you credit a lot of that to the trust that's been built up? Is that a big portion of it?
Yeah, and I think you do have to listen. You have to find those partners who are willing to try things and actually engage with them as partners. Take the time to listen. One of the things we did early on was I got a grant from an individual here in Colorado who wanted to keep their money here in Colorado. And I pitched hiring an agricultural fellow, somebody who could get in their car, drive around, sit at people's coffee tables, or kitchen tables, have a cup of coffee or 3, walk the fields with them, and just start to build that trust. And it was really interesting so that person stayed with us. He's amazing. Aaron Derwingson. He's you probably worked with him.
Yeah, I know he is. Yeah.
Yeah. And, it was a bit of a gamble, right? I didn't know if it was going to work. And TNC's model has always been put people in the community. Well, I couldn't afford at the basin-wide scale to put someone in every community. So I figured, okay, I can start with building in the relationships that we have in some of these communities, but then just get Aaron out there and talking to people. And this is what I mean about opportunity. You have to be a little opportunistic. Sure. So he was just getting started, and it was fascinating to kind of hear people's reaction of like, well, you better not, hire him for 2 years and have him move on, because then we'll have to start all over again. It's like, that's a good point. So I listened, I kept thinking, okay, we got to make this last. But the craziest story was it was a meeting of a bunch of farmers and producers over on the Western Slope in a big district. And they were having their annual meeting, and they had somebody come from California who had been dealing with, like, in the Klamath or something, one of these also very controversial river systems. And the guy was, farmer and ag producer and a head of a district. And he said, the best advice I can give you all is start to figure out which environmental groups you can work with and start working with them, because they can bring resources, they can bring technical expertise, they can be your allies. You can figure things out together. Not every group's going to work with you, but see if you can find one that you can work with. And Aaron and somebody from Trout Unlimited were in the audience, and they said as soon as the talk was over, all these people just turned around and came and just mobbed them and spent the next hour or 2 talking.
That's so
cool. You just never know how it's going to start. But with farmers, it's a lot of looking over the fence. Mm-hmm. And so if they hear from other farmers, oh, yeah, you can trust those guys or gals, that's...
It's everything.
It's everything.
And the reality of that is that you can build up that trust over so long, and it can take 5-10 years, but it can disappear in a heartbeat. And so it's so important. When I would roll into these places speaking with a Southern accent. There's no way around it. I'm not from here.
Yeah.
And I can't, and I'm not an insider. But it seems that, and I've learned this from doing, being in meetings with TNC, but just this endless curiosity about these farmers and their operations, farmers, ranchers. Yeah, how do you do this? Tell me about your family, how long you've been here, combined with, look, y'all are the experts here. This is your land. We've got resources and manpower, and we can help. What do you need?
Yeah.
But a lot of what I've learned has been through observing TNC doing that on many different levels. Another thing that I read that TNC's been working hard on, we talked about the Colorado River Compact in 1922, which there were people here in North America long before that using water. Yeah. And I know that TNC has been working hard with tribal nations to help them with water related issues that are associated with the Colorado River. So I'd love to hear about some of those programs.
Yes, it's true. I mean, we are not the first people here.
Yeah.
And it, I think that's been part of my own journey is the tribes were not part of the conversation. So for a long time, I didn't know to go reach out to the tribes either. And I think a few things have happened. For one, the tribes have made a great case to get themselves into the conversations. There's quite a few tribal leaders who have been out talking to other stakeholders, listening themselves, saying, what's important to you? Who do we have alignment of values with? Who can we work with? So they've done their own homework, and there's been some amazing leaders from different tribal nations that have really helped make the case to the tribes first. We need to be part of this conversation. Decisions are being made, and they will affect the next 50 to 60 years for what happens on our lands. So that was the first step that really changed things, is the tribe started advocating for themselves. And then I would say when you look around the basin and you think about what are the solutions going to look like, you have to work with the tribes.
Yes.
They have the most senior rights. They're great stewards. I think they have similar values with conservation groups.
Definitely.
And not always. They need to look out for their communities. And so it's just like with farmers. We just first have to listen, and we need to understand what they need, and then be a good partner in helping them achieve those goals. And where we can find that alignment, that's really the ultimate goal. But we first need to help ensure that we're not just not doing harm, we're improving where they are, because they have gotten the short end of the stick for way too long.
Yeah, definitely. There was something I read, I think it was in the year-end review, TNC Colorado's year-end review, about a gathering of maybe 6 different tribal nations, and I think it was like 10 conservation groups to kind of work through. What was that event? And I'd love to hear more about it if you remember.
I don't know if I'm thinking of an event. There's a group called the Upper Basin Tribal Dialogue.
Okay.
And that is multiple nonprofits, environmental nonprofits, and the Upper Basin tribes.
Okay.
And they're talking regularly. First you just got to listen to each other and make sure we understand what their interests are, and vice versa. And so first it was almost just like a learning journey.
Yes.
And I think now we're starting to see where that will take us. What are the opportunities to work together? How can we support them? And it can be everything from science, technical support. One of my favorite things that we've been able to do is support capacity building.
Yes.
A lot of the tribes don't have a dedicated water person on staff. And so in a few different places, we've been able to give them the seed money to hire their own person. So like I mentioned with the helping pay for attorneys for the agricultural districts, we're paying for the tribes to hire their own people, which is critical. If you don't have someone waking up in your organization thinking about water every day, it's hard to stay on top of things.
Sure.
And you miss opportunities, or you miss big decisions or big meetings. So being able to support staff who are hired by the tribes and work for the tribes, but maybe we can provide that seed money. That's, to me, one of the best things we can be doing right now, is just helping support their capacity.
Sure. Yeah, definitely. So, I mean, it's just, you've got so much going on. You've got the 30,000 foot national scene to consider. That's all this input. And then you've got all these different projects that you're working on. And the whole environment is changing and somewhat chaotic.
Yeah.
It's like when you wake up in the morning, you're like, all right, time to go to work. Like how do you measure success? Like what are your main, I don't know if you call them metrics. That sounds kind of MBA-ish. I don't like talking MBA terms. But like what is driving your work? Like what if you can look back in 2026 at this conversation, what will you be in 2026 you'd be glad that you accomplished?
I could answer the question on multiple levels, right? Like what does my community look like? What does the Yampa look like? The Verde? All of these communities I hope will be sustainable, will be thriving. They will be having to live with less water. So how can we help them adapt? Can this be a model? Can the Colorado River Basin be a model for the world of a community, big community, that has adapted to the impacts of climate change and water scarcity? Mm-hmm. If we can do it here, I think there's a lot of lessons that we can share with the rest of the world. And that is one thing I love about the Nature Conservancy is we work across the whole planet. So I've been able to work in Australia and learn from them. And I'm now supporting some work in Africa. So I can learn, but I can also share some of the things we've learned. Mm-hmm. But I would say my ultimate goal, what success looks like, is that we are that model, that we have created a system that is adapting to these hotter, drier temperatures, that flexes. So when it's wet, we find ways to recharge our system and make sure that our groundwater is not depleted, and that we can sustain the wildlife that's here, and that we can make a culture where it's recognized that every drop has to do quadruple duty.
Yeah.
It can't just be single uses anymore. 50 years ago, 100 years ago, a community would build a reservoir, and that reservoir was their drinking water. And we just don't have that luxury anymore. We have to be really flexible in our thinking about how water can serve many benefits. It has to have every co-benefit we can think of, and we need to have that mindset that that's the goal, and it's not getting in the way of somebody else's uses.
Yeah, that makes sense. So another thing I want to talk about, we were talking about this before we started recording, but you went to University of North Carolina from Georgia originally. I was saying my accent's still intact. I'm from the country. You're from the city.
Right. I still say y'all.
But how did you end up doing this work? Because I'm always fascinated by people not from the West who end up being such an expert in such a uniquely Western topic. Yeah. And there aren't very many more unique topics than water in the West. Yeah. I mean, it is one of a kind. You grew up in Atlanta, went to Carolina, then what?
Well, my first trip out West was in college, and I was blown away. Just the mountains, the pristine rivers, the everything that's iconic about the West. And but that was definitely a draw. But before college, I think one of the kind of unique parts of my growing up is my family has a family farm that we've had in North Georgia for, since the 30s and 40s.
Got it.
So I grew up with agriculture, as part of our family's history.
Yep.
And then my family was a bunch of politicians and lawyers. And so I kind of got that side going of that poli-sci and government and how do you get things done. But then the really unusual thing was my grandfather's final thing before he died was to build a dam
really?
On the Savannah River.
Okay.
So it's the Middle Dam. So it's Richard B. Russell Dam.
Okay.
And so it didn't do as much damage as some of the others, but that was part of my growing up, was hearing about the importance of having a water supply, the importance of recreation, energy production, all the things that you get from having a dam and a reservoir. It just was part of our daily conversation in our family. My dad and my grandfather would make trips to D.C. to go meet with Jimmy Carter's administration, and it was a Corps of Engineers project.
Wow.
And it was, so I would go visit my grandfather on my way home from Chapel Hill, and he'd be like, you want to go watch the dam being built? So we'd go out and sit and watch a dam being built and go down and talk to the engineers. And that probably is a unique thing.
Did that get in your brain as, man, I might want to do this some version of this professionally? Like, this is really interesting, or was it more just something I do with my family and it's kind of cool?
Well, I'm sure it influenced my thinking.
Yeah.
And what was unusual is this is how I first heard about the Nature Conservancy. Was a family friend was on the Nature Conservancy's board in Georgia.
Okay,
and he was also a lawyer and a good family friend, and he brought up to us, have you ever learned what was flooded when you put in that dam, and some of the issues that they've had with the fishery downstream in the Savannah. And so that was kind of my first inkling of, oh, there's another side to this. There's trade-offs. And then the second piece of what kind of put me on my path was going to Alaska during the oil spill.
Oh, wow.
So I did a NOLS course.
Oh, did you really?
Yeah.
I did NOLS too.
Nice.
Yeah,
What part?
I did a semester in the Pacific Northwest.
Oh, nice.
And that was life-changing for me.
Yeah, it is life-changing. And
so you were up there
right after the oil spill. We were the only group that went out on Prince William Sound that year, and we were a kayak trip.
Kayaking.
And we saw so much devastation, the wildlife that had been killed, and the things they did to try to fix it sometimes made it worse. Mm-hmm. And so it just really sunk into me of like, we can do better than this.
What year was that?
89.
Okay. I remember. And you were in high school or college? College. Yeah. I clearly remember when that happened and seeing in, I guess, like Time Magazine, all the photos. Awful. I mean, I clearly remember it being a kid. I would have been like 12.
Mm-hmm. And we made it worse.
What a historic moment to be up there.
Yeah. And you don't even realize it when you're in it, right?
No.
But what really struck me is how much worse they made it.
How?
So to get the oil off the rocks, they used really high-pressured, extremely hot water in a very fragile cold water system. Yeah. So they killed everything along the shores. The garbage they created was unbelievable.
And when you say they, is that who was doing that?
The cleanup effort.
Okay.
Which, I mean, all sorts of things went wrong, like with that. Where they didn't have the booms.
Sure.
They couldn't get the booms out there in the time that they were supposed to. In other parts of the world, in places that have oil production, they do drills all the time, and they hadn't done drills in like years. So there were a lot of things that didn't need to go so badly, and they made it worse, like than it had to be. And so that really struck me as you do have to be thoughtful. You do have to look at the trade-offs. You have to understand that all of these systems are complex. And if you press down over here, something's going to pop up over here. And you have to be mindful of those things and try to come up with a good plan and a sustainable and resilient plan before you start taking off and trying to fix things.
I remember when I was on NOLS, we had a conversation, and there was a guy who was very right and very wise for his age. I mean, I was 21, I guess, when I was there, but he was, or 20. And this guy was talking about some coming, environmental problem. And I just had this idea like, well, the people in charge know what they're doing.
Yeah.
And I could have seen myself in your position there in Alaska thinking, being kind of having my mind blown out because, well, the people in charge, weren't they supposed to know how to get the booms out in time? Right. And all of a sudden you realize that it's just people.
Yeah.
And they're just and so somebody's got it. And so why not you become, make that your job and do things the right way. And so I bet that was a wild experience.
So between that and then, growing up in a farming, agricultural community, and then this, building a dam, like they just kind of all came together.
Isn't it funny looking back? In hindsight, it all makes perfect sense, right?
Right.
So you went to law school as well. How did that, when you look back now, how has that helped you? Because I feel like a lot of the successful lawyers I know who are applying their legal skills to things that I feel like are very important, a lot of them say it helped them think in a very specific way. Yeah. Do you agree with that? Or?
Yeah, I think it helps you think in a particular way. It's very logical, and it also it trains you to be persuasive. Sure. You have to think about, well, what does that person need to hear for them to come to my side of the table? So it teaches you how to be persuasive. It teaches you a secret language. I think it just gives you confidence that if you need to go understand how a law works or why it was passed, you know how to do that. So it kind of cracks open that code, which I think can be a barrier for people if they're not a lawyer, they think, oh, I can't possibly understand that. And so it just gives you the key to that code. It also teaches you how to write well, which is a little bit of a lost art these days with, just the ways our computers work. But I think that goes back to that persuasiveness too. You have to be able to write well and help explain the problem, think through critically what the solutions might be, and then implement those solutions.
And when did you start at TNC?
2008. This was a new program. And the reason for the program was just all of the basin states were working on the Colorado River or its tributaries, but without an overarching vision. So every state was kind of doing its own thing. And so the state directors in our region were like, we should maybe have someone thinking about this from the higher level.
So 2008 does not seem like that long ago.
No.
At all. I mean, it does. It
15
really,
years though.
Because I guess I was in grad school then, and it really does not seem like that long.
Yeah.
So 15 years. What has kept you at TNC? Because you're obviously super engaged, super energized by the work. We're recording this at the end of a long day for you, and you're so energized by the work. What is it that's kept you so energized about the work and about TNC?
Yeah. So I worked for government, local governments, and then a regional government before coming to TNC on water. I've worked on Colorado River issues for 25 years. What is different for me? I mean, there's some downsides in that we don't have authority. So we are literally leading from behind. What I love is that we have a bit of an army. We have people in the Verde. We have people in the Gila. We have people in the Virgin. We have people in the Yampa. So we have people on the ground forming these connections, coming up with project ideas, and then we get to go implement them. We actually get to be part of the solution. We may not be able to change what's going to happen in those negotiation rooms, but we can put solutions on the ground that help communities, help farmers, and our ultimate goal is to create that ripple effect that starts to become just the path that we're all going to be on. And I think that's what gives me hope. And also what I love about working for TNC is most of the time it's like, well, how can we help? Whether it's our donors or whether our leadership is like, okay, what do you need to make this project happen?
Yeah.
And I think that's exciting in a time when there's a lot of political mistrust, there's a lot of tension between the states. To be able to focus on solutions feels like something really worthwhile right now.
It definitely is. And I think y'all obviously do such great work, but then I think TNC just does such a good job telling the story of the work you're doing and I think more people need to hear that because even just I was listening to some podcast in preparation for this, and it was about the Colorado River, and it was through the LA Times.
That was good.
It was very informative, but I was paying attention, I guess, because now this is kind of my business. But there's some super ominous, scary music playing in the background, and it is ominous and scary. But at the same time, I think by focusing on the solutions, that's what gets people energized and gets people who want to participate and help. So speaking of that, somebody listening to this who maybe lives in Denver but has a normal job like in finance or whatever, but would like to help in some way, how can people be involved?
Yeah, I think the first thing to do is just educate yourself a little bit. It is complicated, but it is for the basics. It's not that complicated. So just to, do a Google search on water law in your state. I think that's a very basic thing. There's lots of primers out there that just give you a little bit of an overview. Understand where your water comes from.
That's huge.
It's huge. I mean, Colorado Springs, about 70% comes from the Colorado River. Denver is about 50%. If you look at the whole Front Range, it's about 50% of the water supply comes from the Colorado River. So if you're getting your drinking water from over here, but you love to go and camp and fish and ski on the western slope, they're connected.
Yes.
And so understanding that interconnection, I think, is really important because we are all connected. And, sometimes people say, oh, California's doing this or Colorado's doing that or Arizona's doing this with the, pointing the finger. It's like we're all part of the problem and we can all be part of the solution. So I would just say learn where your water comes from, how it's interconnected to the rest of the system is a good start. And then I would say just being able to talk to your officials, whether it's Denver Water or whether it's your senators, U.S. senators, state senators. There's often changes in our laws. Right now, our U.S. senators are making a push to create funding to help us adapt to climate change. That's hugely important. And so being able to speak up in favor of those kinds of things and let your elected officials know is also really important. When it comes to your daily decisions, there's a lot we can do. Think about what they call your water footprint. It's just like your carbon footprint, but we make decisions every day that result in more or less water use. The biggest thing you can do is look at your landscaping. That's where 2/3 to 3/4 of our water use from a single home is on outdoor use.
So crazy.
So there's, we've got all sorts of bills being passed that will pay you to reduce your water, your lawn perhaps, or do xeriscaping, or any of those things will make a big difference. We are going to have to learn to live with less.
Yes.
And so while cities use a smaller amount than agriculture, we can all do our part. And it really helps politically when our cities are doing everything to tighten their belt. It helps farmers feel like, okay, they're part of the solution too. So from an optics perspective, it's very important, I think.
Yeah.
And then with farmers, helping, buying locally when you can and just finding ways to support those local producers is really important. And then something you can do or a listener could do that may not be obvious is supporting groups like the Nature Conservancy, like Trout Unlimited, Audubon, all these groups that are working with producers right now to find ways to reduce their water use. So that's not something an individual could probably do. They're not going to be able to go work with a group of farmers, but you can support organizations that are working with producers to figure out those ways to reduce their water use.
I think all those are great. And I think with the landscaping thing, even, somebody could argue, well, it's not going to make a difference. But there's something about getting enough people in that solution-oriented posture of it's like recycling or putting the light bulbs, not the old-timey light bulbs in. It just gives you this posture of having a solution-oriented mindset.
Yeah.
And if enough people do that, it does add up.
Yep.
So last question. I'm always obsessed with books. I always asking people about books they love because I've talked to all these smart people and I want to kind of understand the books or the influences that kind of let them turn into who they have turned into. Are there any books? I sometimes ask about just specifically about the West.
Yeah.
And I know there are a lot of awesome water books, but any books come to mind that have been important to you in your development as a professional and just human being?
Oh, wow. Cadillac Desert is one people always refer to, but they refer to it for a reason.
That's right.
It's older, but the issues haven't changed that much. Issues like too much salt in the system, the fact that farmers are using a big majority of the water and that there are ways they can reduce. And like, for example, marginal lands. That was the first place I ever heard that idea that, every farmer knows which lands are more productive. Keep those lands in production, and maybe those acres at the edge that take twice as much water but grow half as much as the rest, take those out of production. Like, where can we tighten our belts? And so Cadillac Desert is really just an amazing book that kind of gives you that whole overview. And it's funny, I read it in college and it was like, page, I didn't really mean much. And then when I got this job, I read it again.
I love books like that. Yeah. When you revisit them.
And I knew the people now. I was like, I know all these people.
Isn't that wild?
So that one to me is just a really, helps. It's definitely got a perspective and a slant, but I think it's a good primer. Yeah. And it's a story. He kind of weaves it together.
For as thick as it is and as dense as it is, it's very readable.
Yep.
It's almost like mandatory reading. I bet I read it 10 years ago.
It's worth reading again.
And that was before, I knew a little bit, but I still know a little bit, but a little bit more. Yeah. And I'd need to revisit that. That's a good one.
The other one I love is Emerald Mile.
Yeah.
That's more of an adventure story, but it tells the story. It swings the pendulum back and forth between what was happening in the canyon and what the Bureau was doing to try to not have Glen Canyon fail, and not have water topping over it. So it also just helps people maybe understand that we are at the mercy of Mother Nature, and to understand that we can have a year like California's having where it's flooding and crazy amounts of snow, and then we might have 5 years of unbelievable drought.
Yeah.
And so just helping us all get our minds around it, but told through the lens of an adventure too.
That's an awesome book. I've gotten to hang out with Kim Fedorko.
Yeah.
And he's such a funny and good dude.
Good storyteller.
I'm always glad when there's some piece of art like that I love, and then you end up meeting the person and I like it even more because they're so cool.
Yeah.
But that's for somebody who doesn't want to go, the 500 pages or whatever, kind of like desert. I always recommend
can read this one.
Emerald Mile.
Yeah.
Well, this was so fun. Thank you. I know
you.
you've had a big day today, but this was I learned so much, and I feel better about the world, and you're doing awesome work. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you. I really appreciate it.
Hey, it's Ed again. Thanks so much for listening to the podcast. I know your time is valuable, so it means the world that you spend it listening. If you want to support the podcast and help it to continue to spread and grow, there are a few ways you can help. Number one, pass it along to a friend or share it on social media. Word of mouth recommendations are the most powerful way for ideas to spread, so I'd love it if you could share the podcast with a few pals who might enjoy it. Number two, you can go to Apple Podcasts and give it a 5-star review. Good reviews encourage the Apple overlords to suggest the podcast to others. So there's a link in the notes if you'd be so kind as to give it 5 stars. Number three, you can support the podcast financially via Patreon, and there are exclusive benefits for those who do, including a monthly behind-the-scenes newsletter, Mountain and Prairie stickers, live and recorded video chats with podcast guests, and much more. Number four, I've also got 2 emails that I send out. The first is my weekly email called Good News from the American West, which I send out every Wednesday. It's only positive news, something we can all use a little more of these days. And my other email is my bi-monthly book recommendations email. One email every other month with 5, 6, 7, or 8 books that I've recently read and highly recommend. The thousands of people on both of these lists will vouch for me. No spam or other funny business. And number 5, finally, check out my online store for Mountain and Prairie stickers, shirts, and coffee mugs. I've got some really cool designs from Western artists with more on the way. So head to mountainandprairie.com/shop to check it all out. I'd love to connect with you. I'm on Instagram and LinkedIn, so look me up on either of those platforms by my name or through the links on my website. All right, that's it. Thanks so much for your support.